Good morning again. New week. Thank you again for joining Justification. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you for allowing me into your homes, into your hearts. And thank you for allowing the take that we are taking on the Bible into your devotional conversations, faith, and course of learning. There is a lot of unlearning and a lot of training and new discipline that goes into taking our faith seriously. And our last meeting, we sort of ended on this note, and we will touch on it more. There is a point where the reality of it all, without all of the philosophy, without all of the doctrine, needs to be touched on. But our last meeting together, we focused a lot on the definition of, or the context of, the approach that we are to now approach the living God with. And it's for the sake of our human being. Ultimately, it is for the growth and the development of our faith's intellect, the growth and the development of our conversation's conscience. This is the new covenant promise. The new covenant promise is for a resurgence in our thoughts and our feelings devotionally, and in our experience. It would be a perpetual experience of growth and development for our conversation's conscience. We will know the living God. We will not have to go anywhere. Our conversation will know more than we already believe we know. We'll know the living God for real. And we'll need to go nowhere else, but we will become that stream edifying whoever comes into contact with us. And it is for this purpose that this edification inwardly is for our human being. The natural mind within our human being, we are born fractured. We are not born with enough sense to understand who we are, to not do the things that are not us. And so the Bible would allow us to have this experience of learning who we are through a course of learning, directing us to discipline our thoughts and our feelings, but being not natural beings. We're not natural, essentially. We're mental, we are inward. It is our mental and our inward that needs to be disciplined first before our natural human mind and being can actually go through the course of learning it needs to for us to enjoy this living experience. And that's what it comes down to. It comes down to us not being hard on ourselves about our living experience. It comes down to us enjoying this living experience. It comes down to us not taking for granted this living experience. And to do that, we need to be educated in the sense of who we are and who we are not. And that begins inwardly. And so that's where we're going to take this meeting together, is we're going to look at the definition of, because in one word, salvation. And all of these words, salvation, redemption, sanctification, justification, they all connect. And we ended our last meeting together talking about the salvation of God, because those that would order their conversation aright or correctly, says in the book of Psalms, these are the individuals the Bible would let us know will be led to the salvation of the living God. And that's a little bit different from what we know. From what we know, it's really not who orders the conversation. In a sense, the conversation is already ordered and taken care of. All there needs to be is a receiving of that salvation at some time in the future. But the Bible's concern is really not about sometime in the future. The Bible's salvation is right now, while our heart beats, while our brain has function, while our mind has the opportunity to think and to feel. And so we're going to spend this time together talking about the definition of the salvation of the living God. Past that, ordering is where my mind is at. My mind is at going beyond that order. What does that ordering of the conversation mean that leads to the salvation of the living God? We're going to get into this because this is important. It's important because our thoughts and our feelings, I will always come back to this, because that's all we are. We live, we act, we do, we feel, we operate, we believe through our thoughts and our feelings. This is how we, without maybe even knowing it, take our intelligence to be credible. By what we think and by what we feel, we move and we do. These need to be re-educated, and these need to be realigned for the growth and development of our human being. And so how does the Bible define its salvation? Opening to the book of Kings, the second book of Kings. 2 Kings chapter 13 verses 20 and 21. 2 Kings chapter 13, 20 and 21. 2 Kings chapter 13, 20 and 21. It reads, and Elisha died. Elisha died, and they buried him. And the bands of the Moabites invaded the land at the coming in of the year. And it came to pass, as they were burying a man, that, behold, they spied a band of men. And they cast the man into the sepulchre of Elisha. And when the man was let down and touched the bones of Elijah, he revived and stood up on his feet. This is the Bible definition of salvation. The moment the bones, certain bones are supposed to be touched by certain dead individuals, a reviving is supposed to occur. And this is relevant to us due to everything that we have been reviewing thus far concerning terms and context within the Bible, and especially the term of death and the context of it. Now, the death referenced is not a literal death. The death referenced is not physical. It is a mental death. It is an inward death. It is a death to the experience due to something preventing or prohibiting it from reaching that point of life or revival or resurgence. When our conversation is allowed to touch the bones of a particular dead individual, the bones of a particular dead individual, separate the individual from their bones. Our dead conversation needs to touch these bones. And upon touching these bones, they will revive. Again, a couple chapters back, same book, 2 Kings chapter 5. 2 Kings chapter 5. 2 Kings chapter 5 verses 13 and 14. 2 Kings chapter 5. 2 Kings chapter 5 verses 13 and verses 14. And his servants came near and spake unto him and said, my father, if the prophet had bid thee, do some great thing, wouldest thou not have done it? How much rather then when he saith to thee, wash and be clean? Then went he down and dipped himself 7 times in Jordan, according to the sayings of the man of God, and his flesh came again like unto the flesh of a little child, and he was clean. Again, this is the definition of how the Bible would call salvation. It is the coming again of the flesh. This is an individual captain of the host of Syria that had an ailment and came to a particular individual believed to hold knowledge of the living God. Was told what to do, fretted against it, ended up doing it, and the result was the coming again of his flesh. Again, this is pointing towards what we today at this point in time have to do. We have to wash in a certain pool. And the deadness that is on us, and this goes back again, times before, the us is not us literal, the us is not us physical. The us is our devotional conversation. These illustrations in the Bible, though they are written for a physical, with a physicalness, though they are written in this kind of context, we are reading them and we have to align them with where we are and with what we are at this point in time. We cannot expect to go into a literal pool of water and to come up having a diseased flesh, having something inwardly harming us externally or externally harming us inwardly, and to have no sign of it remaining. That's not what the Bible is pointing to. The Bible is not pointing to anything literal. There is nothing literal about this that we should take. This is given to us to put into a context of what we are supposed to go through inwardly. It is now an inward task. And we are to inwardly have something washed so that we may have our flesh freshly come again. We are to touch the bones of an individual that we may revive and to come again. To the Bible's mind, the definition of salvation is a reviving from death. A reviving from death is the Bible's definition of salvation, and not when we're literally dead. That's the tricky part. Or maybe not. From everything that we have discussed thus far, it is not a physical experience that the Bible would have us go through. We are supposed to go through a mental and an inward experience. This is exactly what the man prayed for in the book of Psalm 51. Give me a clean heart, renew, revive my spirit. This is the essence of the living God's definition of salvation. But revive and clean from what? From death. What death? Book of Ephesians 2, verse 1. Just focusing on that one verse, is just one short verse. Is that Paul lets us know, begins this verse by saying, you have been dead in your sins and transgressions. So, bam, answer. Dead in sin and in transgression. In sin and in transgression. And it's good that we went through the definition of what sin is, because now we're not reading this according to what we perceive the definition of sin is. We're not reading this according to what we infer, or what our inference of what the definition of sin is, according to what we know and according to what we have inherited based on that definition from outside sources. We now know the definition of sin according to the Bible. And that sin leads to death. And that if dead, we are in sin. And so we are in our sins. We are in sinning. And we are in death through sins and transgressions. Ephesians 2, verse 1. Remember, it's the morning. And I'm there with you. I'm right there with you. Right there with you. Ephesians 2 and verse 1 says, you hath he quickened, you who being dead in trespasses and sins. So this is where the death is. The death isn't literal. The death isn't physical. The death isn't actual. The death is in trespasses and sins. Wherever trespass and sin is, that's where death is. So death is a concept. Death is an actual. It's a concept. In the book of Colossians 2, verses 10 and 11. The book of Colossians 2, verses 10 and 11. Colossians chapter 2, verses 10 and 11 reads, and ye are complete in him, which is the head of all principality and power, in whom also you are circumcised with the circumcision made without hands, in putting off the body of the sins of the flesh. Now this is more detail. This is more detail of what that death is. That death is a body. That death is a body. It is a body of sins of the flesh. Now this flesh, again, don't think literal, because what we're reading about is not literal. Nothing here is literal. Nothing here is physical. The physicalness should be applied to the realm of our devotional conversation. It is the body of our conversation that is inflamed with sin. It is the body of our conversation that is dead. It is the body of our conversation that must revive. The body of the sins of the devotional conversation. This body is a body of understanding. This body of the sins of the devotional conversation. Nothing here is physical. Everything here is inward. Everything here is relating to our body of faith. We've heard this before, right? To our body of faith. Everything here is in relation to the temple within. When he spoke of his raising, he spoke of his temple. It says in the book of John. It is our temple. It is our devotional conversation that is to go through this reviving, that is to go through this redemption, that is to be connected to and acknowledged as being filled naturally with sin, with death. And so now Paul's going to get a little bit deeper with it. A little bit deeper with it in the book of Romans. Romans chapter 6 and verse 20 and 21. Romans chapter 6 verses 20 and 21. The book of Romans chapter 6 verses 20 and 21. For when you were servants of sin, you were free from righteousness. What fruit had ye then in those things whereof ye are now ashamed? For the end of those things is death. Now keep in mind, the concept behind death is that there are things to accomplish that leads to it. There are things to accomplish that lead to death. There are things to accomplish that lead to death. Going a chapter forward in the book of Romans chapter 7 and 5 and 6, Paul explains what these things are and what this main thing is. Romans chapter 7 verses 5 and 6. Romans 7, 5 and 6. Romans 7, 5 and 6. For when we were in the flesh, the motions of sins which were by what? When we were in the flesh, let's translate this. When we were living by our conversation, when our conversation was dictating our thoughts and our feelings and our belief, our gestures and our devotion, when our conversation was leading, meaning that we were doing to feel, meaning that we were doing to show a feeling, meaning that we were putting forth and spending physical energy to relay a wisdom for a show of devotion. When in the conversation, the motions of sins which were by the law did work in our members to bring forth fruit unto what? When we lived in our conversation, when we did those things related to the edifying of our conversation, they only brought forth fruit unto death, says Paul. When we were in the flesh, the motions of sins which were by the law did work in our members to bring forth fruit unto death. But now we are delivered from the law, that being dead wherein we were held, that we should serve in newness of spirit and not in oldness of the letter. This is the controversy. This is the controversy. This is where the definition of sin and death gets distorted when we bring our traditional thoughts and feelings into the matter. Because the issue within the Bible has nothing to do with what is physical. The issue within the Bible has nothing to do with what is naturally, biologically, carnal, or lewd, primarily. The issue within the Bible has to do with being delivered, which in the book of Galatians chapter 3 and verse 16, the term delivered is exchanged for redeemed. Being delivered or redeemed from the philosophy of the religious law is the controversy and is the gateway or the highway to salvation. Salvation is alleviation from death. Salvation is alleviation from death for the purpose of salvation. Salvation is alleviation from death for the purpose of salvation, that we may know what death is. That death is brought to us by doing the things connected to the philosophy of the religious law. This is the argument that Paul and that the first apostles were putting forth to Jewish Christian ministers at this time about the train of thought, their theories, their speeches, their discourses, their lectures, their group talk. Everything should be connected to this one thing, because it is a real thing that needs to be talked about. The scheme of receiving from the precept of men must be turned over now, because the Bible is pointing us into a direction due to the crucifixion of that individual for an inward healing, and for an inward healing for the sake of our human being. Being tied to the foundation of the religious law, it is bringing forth continually fruit unto death, which means sin and transgression, which means we are not experiencing salvation. Our conversation is to be dead to those things connected to the philosophy of the religious law. The redemption that is within the Bible, the deliverance that is within the Bible, remaining consistent with the narrative that is within the Bible, is a redemption, is a deliverance, is a salvation from the philosophy of the religious law. Reason being is for the experience. Now maintaining, and I've gone through this before, and I've mentioned this in another time that we've met, is that when I pronounce these things, when I write these things, when I lecture on these things, when I talk about these things, it then goes down to, so I've been doing all of these things in my church. I've been doing all of this, the eating of the bread and stuff. I've been, everything that, the different rites and passages that I've gone through in my church, to be confirmed into it and to be accepted by God. You're telling me that all of this has been the definition of sin and transgression? And it's absolutely shocking when I break these things down and relay the message to the point of it's really not about what you have been doing, it's about what these things represent. So you're doing all of these things with all of the faith that you have, well be it. But there's going to come a point in time where your experience is going to have to transcend this. Right? It's going to have to transcend this. Your belief is going to no longer need to trust that Jesus did it all for me and I need to continue to do these things, because as a human being and a human experience, that's not enough. And the Bible knows that it's not enough. That's why the new covenant promise is, I will write my law in your heart and in your mind. Now, if there is a religious law that we are abiding by, and we know the creed of our denomination and of other denominations we hop into when we're not satisfied by our own denomination. If the laws of these added up are creating one single law that we are keeping within our heart for our belief, and yet the living God, his own self, has a philosophy that he would allow or would like to have allowed written within us, we have a conflict, because isn't it written, one cannot serve two masters? There needs to be a decision. A decision needs to be made. We are going to remain faithful to the places that we hop, skip, and jump into when we're not fed, or we're going to take the time to know the living God's devotional character through experiencing his words and going through that living experience, knowing how it will better our human being, knowing how it will better our faith, that we may have that invisible hand etching onto our character the living God's name. Two experiences, we have to make the decision, because this is what Paul is pointing to. Even though this language is it's philosophical and it's doctrinal, reviewing this is to let us know that there is a route that our faith is supposed to go on. And it may have been decent to do a particular route for the stage that we were in, but there's going to come a point in time, and the Bible is letting us know that that time is now, where we have to acknowledge and realize that the ways and the trends to reach the living God are not satisfying, not necessarily to the living God, but to our human being. We need more. Paul's letting us know that this more, being freed and liberated from the foundation of the philosophy of the religious law, no longer abiding by the pen of priest and minister, ancient and present, we can enter into the presence of the living God on a consistent basis, patiently and temperately, to have that philosophy, to have the law of the living God's heart engraved within. And that's what matters. In this sense, this is us reviving from death. This is us escaping death. So in summary, the definition of salvation needs to be understood while our heart is currently beating. The Bible lets us know that salvation takes place while our heart beats. While our heart beats, salvation is taking place. The second point we need to understand is that there is a reviving in order for this salvation to take place from death. And that this death, third point in summary, that this death occurs through the philosophy of the religious law and occurs through doing what is done through the philosophy of the religious law. All of these taken into consideration, in summary, our fourth point is that the definition of salvation, being a redemption or a deliverance from the experience of the philosophy of the religious law, is a regeneration of thought and of feeling devotionally or spiritually from the philosophy of the religious law. The book of Galatians 4:21 through 24. Galatians 4:21 through 24 reads, "Tell me, ye that desire to be under the law, do you not hear the law? For it is written that Abraham had two sons, the one by a bondmaid, the other by a free woman. But he who was of the bondwoman was born after the flesh, but he of the free woman was by promise. Which things are an allegory. For these are two covenants. The one from Mount Sinai, which gendereth to bondage, is Agar." And then Paul goes on to let us know that the one by promise is an allegory representing the promise of that living God's new covenant that we are to accept without the bondage of a religious law, tying us down and chaining us down to its thoughts and to its feelings. That was Galatians 4 again, Galatians 4:21 through 24, where Paul's again letting us know that we need to accept the living God's definition of salvation from the Bible. We need to accept the philosophy of the religious law and how we are operating our conversation as being erroneous. This is why it says in the book of Psalms, "He that ordereth his conversation aright correctly, he that ordereth his conversation correctly will see the salvation of God." The time to let go of our faith and our confidence in the things that we would do and believe and theorize on and ritualize, they need to let go. These things need to be let go that we may know what that salvation is.